My name is Charlie. I'm the youth pastor here, and we're continuing our series on relationships. Thank you, Kelly. And we're talking about dating today. Yeah, woo! And usually you start something like this with a funny story, a quip, or a hook. But today we're actually going to start with just a little bit of caution. Because of the nature of dating, and because River's Edge seeks to be biblically based and incredibly practical, we're going to be talking about certain aspects of dating that I'm going to use a code word for is intimacy. And if for some reason you have a child in here today who you don't want to go home and ask mom and dad, what does that word mean? Perhaps today is a good day to check out our children's ministry while we talk about dating. Now, I'm not going to be explicit or detailed or anything like that. It's just, as you see behind me, there are 5 bubbles. The 5th bubble has a phrase that I'll be using often. And if that's just not something that you want to have to deal with today, I just wanted to give you a heads up. But that segues into a story. When I was 18, I was homeschooled, by the way, and I went to a co-op, and there was a homeschool debate class there, which you can imagine was fun. And we had a variety of topics that we discussed. And about halfway through the semester, we had the opportunity to bring up ideas of what we would like to do to finish the semester, topics to debate. And I raised my hand, and I brought up the idea of sexuality and sexual ethics, which an adult responded by quoting a verse to me. And this verse goes like this: "It is shameful to mention what the disobedient do in secret," which was her way of saying it is wrong, and so we're not going to talk about it, which you can imagine I responded super well to as an 18-year-old. But that idea, unfortunately, is not exclusive. It is something that happens collectively in the church very often. We talk about certain ideas like dating and like sexual ethics in a super lofty way. We have these great ideas, these ideas that are in the clouds. One book I read growing up was called I Kissed Dating Goodbye, and that is a perfect example of an idea in the clouds. But when it actually rubber meets the road, actual practical application, sometimes we fail in giving you actual concrete stuff to do. And what was super interesting is that's not an issue that was back then. It's still something that we deal with today, because in the research that I did for this, we like to listen to speakers and teachers that we respect and their content and look at more mainstream views on this. And honestly, a lot of what I found was super disappointing. A lot of it was full of stereotypes, especially against millennials. A lot of it was full of really impractical ideas and just a clear lack of grasp on the dating culture that we have today. And so it is definitely our effort today to be as practical as possible with this. And I also want to throw in another caution. It is possible that you've listened to this because the majority of you in the room are not dating, or that phase is not in your life, or it has passed your life. However, I want to give you this idea. You are always dating something. In other words, you are always romantically pursuing something. The romantic pursuit given to us by God, we see this in Ephesians 5, is a living example of God's relationship to us. He describes the relationship between a man and a woman and that romantic pursuit, and it displays his pursuit of us, that he has that level of intensity towards us, that level of love. But we also see that this romantic pursuit that God has instilled in all of us can be perverted and twisted. And I love James 1:14 through 15, because he kind of gives a similar cycle that we're going to talk about today. If I can get to my notes. He says, "Each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desires and enticed. Then after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death." You may have saw already on the screen behind me that there was 5 cycles of a romantic pursuit, a relationship, a dating relationship, attraction, values, tribal support, commitment, and sexual intimacy. Fun fact, that is only one bubble away from being the exact cycle, just using different words, of addiction. It is also, in my opinion, the identical cycle of how we choose sin. And I love how James represents the realization, the practical realization that sin is not just a choice that erupts out of nowhere, it's a progressive traveling towards that choice. It's a progressive aspect of our lives that we make to arrive at a certain place. And while it is true in dating, we're going to look at this today. We're going to look at dating hopefully in very practical ways, but also compare side by side what Satan has done to the romantic pursuit. Because Satan cannot create, he only perverts. And he's perverted what God gave to us and intended for good into something that creates massive devastation in our lives. And so, without any further ado, let us handle the first step of dating and the romantic pursuit, which is attraction. And attraction, I feel like sometimes gets hit on the most. That was the wrong phrase to use, but really punny if you think about it. That was not planned. Hated on the most because it's seen as a shallow pursuit, physical attraction or whatever. And we have that based off of 1 Peter 3, which says we should not look at the external, but look at the inward beauty that is within. But also, we just spent an entire week last week hearing Jacqueline and Chase talk about Song of Solomon, in which we heard Chase's legs described as pillars, which I will never, ever be able to forget, ever. But clearly, there's an entire book of the Bible devoted to physical attraction as a holy thing, as a good thing that God has given us. And so physical attraction or attraction in general only becomes shallow when it's the only thing that we rely on. And I think we can all nod our heads and agree to that. But what is fascinating about attraction, and I should probably look at my notes, is we don't know, scientists don't know what causes people to be attracted to one another. They kind of shrug their shoulders and we say there are certain factors that sometimes are sometimes there, but not always consistently. We don't really know what draws somebody to somebody specifically, but there are a lot of different reasons why we experience attraction, whether it be something like the physical or personality or humor or their position in life or whatever they are doing. But it is the first step when you notice somebody. I am attracted to my wife. I think she's attractive. That was the first step of our relationship. But what is fascinating is when you take this cycle and you pervert it, it's also the first step towards sin, the first step towards addiction. The attraction to something that takes place really only in our mind. A desire, as James says, that starts conceiving. A wish, a fantasy, something that we dwell upon. And Jesus warned us that the sins, oftentimes that we can't see, take place in the heart, but they are the same as sins that we may act out. And so with that cycle, we see that God has given us a romantic pursuit of attraction, but also something that gets perverted. Now, what is fascinating about attraction is, I said this in the last service. I said I'm fascinated by studies on attraction, which is not true. I'm fascinated in studies in general, but there was a research thing done on how could they influence attraction between blind dates, and what could they figure out with that. So they took 45 girls who did not know they're going to go on blind dates that were a study with one guy. And for the first 15, he was instructed to agree with everything that she said. And then she was pulled out after that survey and asked, how attractive is that person? And not surprisingly, that person was rated moderately to highly attractive. Then they took the next 15 and instructed the guy, disagree with everything she says, which, not shockingly, did not go well. And they rated him very low on the attraction level, which I don't think is a shock to any of us. It shouldn't be. But then for the last 15, they did something fascinating. They instructed him to disagree for the first half and then agree for the second half of the date. And his attraction levels were higher than all the rest. And this segues into values, because this is why. They felt like they were changing him. They felt like they were having a difference in his life. They started off with this grumpy whatever dude, and he became this nice, loving guy, and they're like, I've done something. But that segues well to values, though, because I usually don't want to say always or never phrases, but you should never date somebody with the hope of what they could be. Amen. Seriously, though, when values don't align, do not assume that somehow they're just going to magically align down the road. That I'm sure there are exceptions. I know there are exceptions, but I would say 9 times out of 10, that backfires pretty severely. And let's just take a big example and a good example like Christian faith. And one of the major reasons why people get divorced, money. In the Christian faith, there is a pretty significant and obvious mandate on tithing. 10% of the income is what we classically do. And can you imagine that with somebody who does not have that value system and sees 10% of their income leaving the bank account every month? Do you not think there will be conflict there? Don't honestly even talk about raising children or talk about ethics and values and how you work and what you do with your life and what is most important. Just think about the consistent amount of values that can have the differentiation of values and all the conflict that can cause from that. But when we are under attraction, we are oftentimes willing to ignore major things like that. And values come up really naturally in conversation. As we talk with people, we realize their perspective, their views, their backgrounds, and we gauge people whether we realize it or not on their values to see if we are similar. But because we are attracted to that person, we are oftentimes tempted to disregard some major values that are misaligned. What was interesting, and this is a super embarrassing story, I was pursuing a girl briefly when I was 16, and I've shared this story before, but I haven't shared the whole details. And it ended up being something that just was not a good idea. But I found out after the fact that her family were Satanists, which is significantly different than my belief system or stage of life, which is a pretty big value change. But I had no idea, because I never asked those questions. When this system gets perverted, though, this is how it works. When we start pursuing sin, we look at our values and we begin justifying why we want to make the choice we want to make. We begin saying to ourselves, does the Bible really say that? Everybody does it. I can do it once. It's not a big deal. I can handle it. All of which are phrases that also lead into addiction as well. But when we pervert that cycle, we begin telling ourselves, how can I get around my value system? But when this cycle goes well, and when we've experienced attraction to somebody that's healthy, and when we've experienced a value system that aligns, that is healthy, the often natural next step is called tribal support, which is another way of saying you introduce that person to your friends and family. And I think this is the best and easiest area to have red flags go up. Because like I said, when you're in an attraction state, you're biased towards that person. There's no way you're not. You literally have a chemical response going inside of your brain that is inhibiting your ability to reason as well. But I love this part because I remember there was a time, and I think I've said this before, all of my dating stories are how not to date. I have every example of what not to do, except for one time when I dated Lexi and married her, so that's my only good example. But most of them were not great. And there was a girl I was pursuing my senior year of college, and there were a lot of issues there, just a lot of things that were going on, but because I was attracted to her, I was biased. And she would tell me these things that were going on, and just be like, okay, yeah. And then one day, I decided to tell my brother what was going on. And the more I talked, the more I was like, oh my goodness, this is bad. Like, this is really bad. Like, this is incredibly toxic and incredibly unhealthy. But you cannot see that on your own and isolated, because what oftentimes happens in tribal support is they're often the people that call out when we begin becoming exclusive. Have you ever had a friend who all of a sudden disappeared off the face of the earth when they started dating somebody? Because all they could do was spend time together. They had to be with each other, walk everywhere together, had to ask permission before they could do anything or hang out with certain people. And it was always an emotional conversation to say, I'm not going to hang out with you tonight. What I would say to that is that a relationship that functions in that way is not necessarily unhealthy, but the person's need for that relationship is unhealthy. If you need that level of closeness and exclusivity in your relationship, then you are filling a need in your life on an unhealthy level. And family and friends are the best people to be able to speak into your life and be like, there's this thing going on that bothers me, or this aspect of this person doesn't line up very well. Have you considered this? And yes, there are times when their advice might not be good and your friends may be suffering from jealousy, but honestly, most of the time, they're the people that know you the best and have the most logical approach to your own relationship. When this cycle gets perverted, though, this is what happens. We seek out entertainment, people, whatever it may be online, some sort of community or person that will support the decision that we're trying to make. And this may be just a very quick, flippant thing, or it may be a long thing. But when we are trying to make a decision that is against what we know is right, is something that we know is wrong, we will try to find support in some way that supports this decision through a community somewhere. And the scary reality is you can find a community that supports anything you want to do. And I do not think that's an exaggeration. I literally mean anything you want to do, you will find someone out there that can support what you're doing. But when we're in that cycle and we're trying to excuse what we're trying to do, we will try to find a tribe, per se, that supports what we're trying to do. And this next bubble is actually my favorite because when I did more research, this is the one that fascinated me the most, and it's commitment. After you've experienced attraction, alignment of values, and that tribal support, the idea of a greater commitment starts coming. And you notice this when you start thinking about your future, and you start thinking about your future with that person. When you start planning things, you're like, but that would inhibit our relationship in this way, because whether you realize it or not, you become more committed to that relationship. Now I'm going to stand up for this one, because this one is fascinating if we want to look at this slide. Because a study was done, because we don't know why someone's attracted to somebody, but they looked at what that looks like in the brain and when that takes place in a relationship. Attraction typically from women, not attraction, the sensation of falling in love for women, usually takes place between attraction and values, typically. In the sequence of things, that's when women usually feel that sensation of falling in love, which chemically, the neurotransmitter in your brain that makes women feel like they're falling in love is oxytocin. And that neurotransmitter skyrockets during sexual intimacy. The neurotransmitter that makes women fall in love skyrockets during sexual intimacy. But men don't fall in love with oxytocin as their main neurotransmitter. It's a different one that I had never heard before I studied. It's called vasopressin. And they tend to fall in love in the commitment stage of the relationship. And here is why. Vasopressin is their main thing that makes them give them that sensation of falling in love. But it's inhibited by a pretty significant chemical called testosterone. Testosterone is at its highest in your life when you are single. Just across the board, your testosterone is at its highest. But it's at its lowest when you're married. And what's shocking, though, is they also did a study and found out it is equally as low if you simply mentally or verbally commit to one person. Meaning that when you are still in that single mindset early on in the relationship, your ability to have that sensation of falling in love is significantly inhibited. But once a commitment is made on a man's part, the ability for that vasopressin to function and feel that sensation of falling in love is like let loose, and they feel that sensation. And this is fascinating to me because a lot of studies also show that men love talking about duty, responsibility, commitment as one of the highest ideals. We celebrate it. We love it because we experience a strong chemical reaction within our brain around the concept of commitment. Women tend to statistically talk a lot more about falling in love at first sight because oxytocin is a lot more accessible for them than it is for men, which is fascinating to me. And this segues well into the sexual intimacy because guess what? You have sexual intimacy too early on in that process, you are breaking up that cycle in a healthy way. When we are sexually intimate with somebody, it is fascinating what takes place in the brain. Sexual intimacy for any person is 4 times more powerful to the brain than morphine. And the area of the brain that is activated during sexual intimacy is the exact same area that is activated if you take cocaine. When a man has sex with a woman, there is a literal temporary photogenic process that takes place. Because they are visually oriented, they are literally taking screenshots and memories of this experience on a biological level because that is how they bind to another person. And every time that you are sexually intimate, you are chemically, through your neurotransmitters in your brain, binding to that person. When a woman has sexual intimacy, she has a photogenic emotional memory and is emotionally binding herself to that person on a chemical level, which is why people get into abusive relationships, are sexually intimate, and have a difficult time leaving because they are literally experiencing an addiction cycle in their brain with that person. Because the chemicals are so strong, it is like they have taken a drug and they are experiencing relapse, they are experiencing withdrawals from it if they walk away from it. And I say all that to say this, you are not smarter than the chemical processes in your brain. There are so many people that believe they are more intelligent, more capable, strong enough that they can have casual sex. There is no such thing in your brain as casual sex. Never will and never will be something like that because you do not get to control how your brain responds. You are literally experiencing one of the most powerful natural binding processes that we know when you are sexually intimate. And you have that too early on with somebody that you don't know their values, is not committed to you, and you have no support for, how well do you think that's likely to end? Or how healthy do you think that is going to function? I love saying this. God is not a prude. He designed this cycle on purpose to protect you and help you experience the things that he wants you to experience in the time that he wants you to experience them. And this is so true for sin as well. When this cycle gets perverted, it is powerful. Because like I said, you were always romantically pursuing something, which means when you have the support system and you're trying to realign your values and you have this attraction towards sin and you commit yourself to that sin, which means you align your life, your money, your time, your emotional energy to do this thing, you are literally experiencing an intimacy with a choice that you are making. You are literally, in that romantic cycle perverted, you are literally experiencing an intimacy on a chemical level with the choice that you are making. Which to me is a fascinating thought process. But it also can sound pretty hopeless if we were to end there. And here's how I want to pick us up from that a little bit. Because there's a lot of people, and I think if we're all honest, we've been in that cycle at some place incorrectly at some point in our life. Or we're there right now. So what do we do about that? And I do not want this to be undersaid at all. Do not underestimate the redemptive power of God. Do not underestimate his romantic power and his ability to pursue you, to take you out of any situation, any scenario that you find yourself, and heal that. There are so many people who have found themselves in devastating places who God has been able to reach and bring out of that romantic cycle that has gone wrong and bringing them into a healthy relationship with the people around them and with him. There is no place that you can go that is so gone and so broken that he cannot bring you out of. The romantic pursuit that he has for you is more powerful than anything we have mentioned today, which is mind-blowing when you think about it, because the processes we have mentioned are incredibly powerful, but yet he is more powerful than those. No matter if you experience that binding process of somebody, which is insanely powerful, which, by the way, with pornography, the exact same binding process takes place. You are not somehow exempt or experiencing a different chemical reaction. That binding process is identical. But he can still take you out of that. But how do we get to that point? How do we get to a point where we can somehow start that redemptive cycle in our own lives? Honestly, the first point, I think I say this in every sermon. I think I have said this in every sermon here to date. The first step is you need to talk to somebody. You need to have an honest conversation with somebody that you trust where you are able to reveal exactly what's going on. And I guarantee if there is not somebody like that in your life, you have 3 pastors in this room, at the very least, who will have that conversation with you, who will not judge you and will not make you feel like you're broken to talk about what is going on. But I also think that is valuable not only just in my perspective, but there is a huge study done, and just to give a little bit of a youth ministry plug real quick, there is a study done on 700 at-risk infants, and they followed them for 20 years, which is a long time. And they wanted to see what is the most significant factor that causes success and health in at-risk teenagers. And they found the most significant factor that shows future success is a single significant relationship with an adult that's not a parent. A single significant relationship with an adult that's not a parent. And parents, you know how this is true. You can say something to your teen 40 times, and they hear it from one other person once, and it's a revelation, and they've never heard that before. You know that's true. Because they need somebody outside of their circle who values them and thinks they are worthy. One of the conversations I had when I was 15 was a random night. I don't even know when it was. My brother drove me home. I don't even know what from, but I remember for an hour and a half we sat in the car and we talked about essentially everything we talked about right now. And that single conversation with an adult that wasn't a parent, I do not exaggerate, shaped the next 6 years of purity for me, without a doubt. A powerful intentional moment, which is why things like Campus Life and things like youth ministry, where we provide an opportunity for teens to have significant relationships with adults who will speak the truth into their life, I believe are invaluable. They are essential to our functioning as a society and as a church. But it extends out of the teenage years. You need significant people in your life that you trust and respect, that can hear what's going on and speak life into you. We are hardwired to connect. Sharice Nixon, who helped do the study that I just mentioned from Penn State University, also said we know only really one of two things. We know about only two things about the human brain that are for certain. And one of those are we are wired and have an insatiable need to connect to people. You need to talk to somebody. Second, you need to admit to yourself, to that person, and to God that you have done wrong. There are so many times that we feel bad about something, but we want to diminish how wrong it was. We try to excuse it. We try to throw other people under the bus or situations or our life environment or whatever it may be to excuse the choices we have made. The reality is all that you are doing is not taking full responsibility for the choice that you have made. Confession to God is vital, but God in Scripture also tells us that we need to confess to our brothers and sisters. So that confession cannot just be some conversation that you and God have. That is important, that is vital, but that also can be a crutch that somehow keeps us away from taking ownership with another person. And third, and our last point before we end today, do not underestimate the power of God's pursuit of you. You are never so far gone. You are never broken enough. You are never so deep into this cycle that you know is wrong that he cannot take you out of. There are situations that I've had the pleasure of hearing from people that God has brought them out of that shock me how deep and how painful and how far people got away from Jesus. And yet still hearing their narrative of how Jesus was able to take them out of that, to me just gives me hope that there literally is no situation that is so far gone that he can't take you out of. I hope today that when you reflect upon this, that I've given you something practical with dating. This is a cycle that takes place oftentimes when we're pursuing somebody romantically. But also be warned, because along this cycle, when we pursue the things that are wrong, there are a lot of red flags that come along. And if you find yourself in that cycle, if you realize that you're on that path, I just cannot say enough. Have a conversation with one of us. Talk to somebody. Have that healing moment and realize that Jesus is pursuing you. We're going to worship in a second. And I just feel like I have to say real quick, if this idea of having a relationship with Jesus is something that is new to you or something that you've not heard before, it is incredibly simple. I've already mentioned it really in its format. You admit that you have done wrong. You admit that you are a sinful person. You have a conversation with him that you want to accept him into your life. And then I would say the third step is that you tell somebody about it so that you can become part of the community that is the church. The single hope, living hope of the world, the church that Christ created and gave to us. So I'm going to pray, and then we're going to continue on in worship. Lord, I thank you so much for your romantic pursuit of us, how you are constantly pursuing us, even when we don't realize it or know it. How the power of your love for us is so raw and so intense that it literally overcomes any situation that we can find ourselves in life. I also thank you that you've created the romantic pursuit between two individuals, that you created a symbol of your love for us in marriage between a man and a woman, and that we get to experience and witness and support people along that path. But I also pray that you protect us from when that goes wrong, when we pursue the things that we know we shouldn't pursue and find ourselves in this cycle that has been broken. I pray that you bring healing. I pray that you bring people into our lives that we are willing to have that conversation with. And I pray that River's Edge always stays that place where anybody can come in and talk about where they have been and experience the redemptive power of Jesus Christ. May we be that wherever we go, or wherever we work and play, wherever we live. I ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.